Seja bem-vindo ao canal Ulisses. Antes de começar o vídeo, deixa o like, subscreve no canal. Para a segunda parte da entrevista, Ivan Van Sertima. A ideia principal do livro. Eles vieram antes do Columbus. Veja o vídeo agora, está legendado.
What is the main idea in your book, They Came Before Columbus?
The main idea in my book is to show that early America before the coming of Columbus, was a far more complex society than people imagined, and that it involved Africans. Africans came in here. They came in on several occasions. Sometimes these were accidents, sometimes they were on purpose, and that they had an influence, an actual impact, an influence upon the formation of certain American civilizations.
When we say pre-Columbus period, what are we talking about?
We're talking about long before 1492. It is absurd, and only fools can still believe that Columbus discovered the Americas in 1492. In fact, Columbus never even came to this continent. Columbus wandered about in the Caribbean islands just on the very edge of the great civilizations. Cortez came here in 1519, and he entered Mexico. And Mexico, when I speak of Mexico in this program, do not confuse it simply with the Mexico we know today. That was a center of a civilization that spread over a great part of this continent. That, when Cortez entered, he had come out of the heart of Europe, and he said when he entered Native America, when he entered Mexico, and he saw the pyramids and the palaces and the floating gardens and the zoos and the aqueducts and the running baths, he says, I have not seen its like in Europe.
So the main idea in your book, you were dealing with that initially.
The main idea in my book is that there were visits to this continent from the old world, that there were visits to the Native Americans in this continent, and those visits included Africans. And two of the visits of Africans were major and significant, and they affected American civilization. And American civilization was far more complex, far more advanced than was formerly believed. Earth satellites a few months ago revealed that the Native Americans, long before the coming of Europeans, had the most intricate network of irrigation canals ever discovered in agriculture.
Okay, let us clear up one thing before we go any further. In the book, They Came Before Columbus, you use the terms Negro Nubian, Negro Egyptian. Why?
Well, that in some ways is unfortunate. I found it necessary to use the word Negro. I no longer use it. I'm now the editor of the Journal of African Civilizations, and I use the word Africoid for African types, skulls, etc. The reason why I was forced to use the word I had been trained in European anthropology and archaeology. All the books I had read used this term, not necessarily with the social implications which it has here. They use this term to separate Africoid types of people from Caucasoids or Mongoloid types, Asiatic and European types. Also, it is a word that has entered neutrally, without any social significance, in the languages of many people who do not have the same kind of prejudices as people in the Anglo-American and some of the Western nations who became colonial powers. Like in some languages in Europe, they use the term Niger, simply meaning black, without any of those connotations. Furthermore, the problem lay in that the word black could not always be used, because if you spoke of a black god, it may not be an African. You can have a black god who is not an African. Tezcatlipoca, for example, is a Native American god who is black, but he's not African. But there is a god, Nawalpili, who is both black and African. He's not only black in a ritual or symbolic sense, but he has Africoid features. So that was the problem I faced. And I had to make those connections, because when people talked of Nubians, they didn't often realize they were talking about black people.
In the first few pages of They Came Before Columbus, you write about when Columbus himself heard about about Africans, the possibility of Africans having been here years before. What about that?
Yes, so Columbus is the first man to give historical witness and evidence of Africans in America before him. In his journals, in his letters, you have evidence of this. He mentions that when he came back from his first voyage, he went to see the Portuguese. He didn't actually go there on purpose. A storm drew him into Lisbon, Portugal. He'd been sent out by the Spanish. The Portuguese invited him to the court, and there he learned from the Portuguese, who were moving across Africa, who had set up the first fort among Europeans in Africa, that African sailors had actually crossed over the Western Ocean and had found a land mass in the south. This was not what Columbus had found. Columbus found islands, which are now known as the Caribbean islands, but he had not gone onto a continental mass. The Africans had found the actual continental mass. And the Portuguese insisted that this continental mass in the south was 370 leagues, which is about 15 to 1600 miles away, according to whether you count a league as 4 or 4.5. There were differences in counting of a league, but it was about 1500 to 1600 miles away from Africa. And they pointed this out. And Columbus went back to Spain and he insisted, because the Portuguese promised to help him, he insisted that they should draw a line across the world, and that this line should be drawn 370 leagues away from the Cape Verde Islands across Africa, and that Spain would claim lands he had found on the other side, and if Portuguese found land within that line on the other side, they could claim it. And Brazil, which was visited by the Africans, was on the other side of the line. And this line was drawn in 1494. It was drawn up in June 1494, before any Europeans had come to South America, on the basis of African knowledge.
De Ulisses Santos para Ulisses Santos TV.